Welcome home, guys. This is At Home Apologetics. I'm Kyle Velasquez. Have you ever heard of the laws of logic? If not, you're probably breaking them. Today, we're going to discuss what are the 3 laws of logic and even touch on if God follows them. Let's get after it. We live in a postmodern or relativistic world that has learned to embrace many different aspects of culture and society from all over the globe. This brings with it different belief systems and thoughts about life and our overall existence. Increasing our ability to be diverse is a beautiful thing in many ways, but in an attempt to be more inclusive, during this process, we have accepted contradictory ideologies and embraced them each as true to themselves. This is an outlook on truth that disregards logic. We have entered into a mix of culture that doesn't know what is what and even claims that what is could be anything. Our ability to process reality has dissolved into a blurred photograph of reality where the defining lines that separate one thing from another are no longer apparent, but allow each thing to bleed into one another. This negates the idea of truth, that is, what corresponds to reality, otherwise known as the correspondence theory of truth. The theory that a thing simply is what it is observed to be really and nothing else. This actually leads us to our first law of logic, the law of identity. This is a law that could be expressed simply that A equals A and B equals B, or this orange is an orange and this pen is a pen. This may seem obvious and simple to some, but when applied to things we often accept in society, you can see where we begin to compromise this law. There are other theories of truth, like the coherence theory, where whatever may be considered true must cohere to a system, not necessarily a thing itself, or the pragmatic theory, where what is true is simply defined by its utility or function. There are other theories of truth as well, but that is not our main goal in this video, as this video is primarily concerning the laws of logic. But it is helpful to point out that most other theories of truth actually rely on the correspondence theory of truth themselves, making it the necessary system of truth even for other truth systems. In today's world, it's hard enough to establish whether truth exists, let alone which theory of truth is correct. You may hear from someone that all truth is relative, but the statement all truth is relative is itself an objective truth statement, which could make the statement itself contradictory. Which brings us to our second law of logic, the law of non-contradiction. This law states that A cannot be A and B cannot be A in the same sense and at the same time. In other words, this orange is not this pen, and this pen could not be this orange in the same sense and at the same time. Maybe someone would try to think about it another way. Someone may try to convince you that perhaps the orange is neither an orange or not an orange, but something else entirely. Maybe what is true is neither true nor false. This unfortunately breaks the final law of logic, called the law of the excluded middle. A thing must either be the thing or not the thing. There is no third answer. So this orange is either an orange or it's not. End of discussion. So what about when it comes to our faith in God? Do the laws of logic apply to God or the belief in God? The answer is absolutely. Some of you may be thinking I'm crazy for saying that I'm placing God in a box or something like that, but let me explain. This is not saying that God doesn't do what most of us would label illogical, because most of the time when somebody claims God defies logic, we are talking about something like miracles or forgiveness of certain people or something like that. And really, it's not that these things are actually illogical in terms of the laws of logic. They're just things that we either can't or wouldn't do. The fact that we can't or wouldn't do these things that God does isn't a true objection to God's use of logic, but an evidence of just how distinct our natures are from one another. This includes our ability abilities or degrees of wisdom, grace, and mercy. Ultimately, God does not break the laws of logic. Many would be tempted to quote Matthew 19:26 that states, "With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible." So first of all, in the context of this statement, Jesus had just confronted the rich young ruler and was explaining to disciples how hard it was for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. So, being astonished, they asked Jesus, "Who can then be saved?" To which we see Jesus' reply, "With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible." Jesus is referring to salvation, the salvation that God offers, which cannot be attained by man's efforts, and that its effect is so great that it can even save those that many would consider unsavable. This, of course, doesn't mean literally that all things are possible for God. He can only do what is logically possible, or what corresponds to the reality of things and of his character and attributes. For example, God cannot make a square circle or a married bachelor. Maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, but maybe he could somehow. The verse states that with God, all things are possible. This would maybe suggest that he could somehow, some way, make a square circle. Respectfully, I'd still insist that you're wrong, but let's say I grant this to you anyways, that he could somehow make a square circle, even if by definition it's contradictory. What if I told you the Bible itself also says that there are several things that God cannot do? For example, God cannot lie, Titus 1:2. God cannot sin or do wrong, Job 34:10. God cannot be tempted by evil, James 1:13. God cannot change, Malachi 3:6. God cannot deny himself, 2 Timothy 2:13. And God cannot be fooled, Galatians 6:7. In other words, these are all things that are impossible for God. Therefore, Matthew 19:26 must not be literal, which in turn opens the door that God cannot do what is illogically possible, which I believe is true. This, however, does not limit his power or awesomeness. Ultimately, we are discussing the laws of logic, and laws need a lawgiver, which in this case is God. And the laws of logic are actually a result of his power and awesomeness, not a limit to them. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Do you agree with the laws of logic? Why or why not? Do you think God follows the laws of logic? Take a moment to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay blessed.